that was presented to me in a few articles that I read as like that is the next step in the transition is empowering and building these workers' communes. And to me, that was what was described to me as being Chavismo and being like the revolutionary project that was set forward. But what we've seen so far are like state capitalist socialist reform policies. And I guess like, do we know like is Chavismo that socialist new 21st century socialist project, or is it going to be more state reform? Like, I don't know if there seemed to be, like Susan was describing, like a more left, more horizontal undercurrent, or like block that was maybe pushing for that more than some of the corrupt and like remnants of the state that still exists, like pre-Chavez. Like, what's your take on?
Well, I guess I'll just skip straight to it. I'm sorry, I'm really disorganized. I gotta apologize. My printer was out of ink, so I had to like scribble all this stuff down like an hour ago. So I'm all over the place. So you want to talk about the communal councils? Mm-hmm. All right. Well, communal councils were set up as part of this initiative that's enshrined in the Constitution to sort of try to move towards what they call participatory democracy, which is a little bit different from the way that we might understand participatory democracy in a country like this, because what you have to understand about Venezuela is that it's a country with almost no tradition of political participation. For years and years, for most of the 20th century, the country was ruled by two governing parties, the AD party and COPE, which is basically a centrist, center-left party and a Christian Democrat party, who had complete control of the political system. And ordinary Venezuelans don't have a tradition of political participation. So when they talk about transitioning from participatory democracy, or from representative democracy to more participatory democracy, it's really key to understand it's more participatory. It's not necessarily direct democracy in the way that we might think of it. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so the first thing that they tried to do in that regard was to set up these local public planning councils. And they failed by and large because of opposition from mayors. They would make sure that opposition mayors would make sure that their people were in charge of these councils, and they would actively repress them. So they moved on to these communal councils. As of right now, there's about 44,000 communal councils in the country. Anybody over the age of 15 can participate in it, and there has to be 20% of the voting population that participates in it for it to be considered an actual communal council. They form working groups made up of committees to help implement new social programs involving healthcare, water, housing, these sorts of things. So you have, on the one hand, the state, which has all of these programs, and it says in the Constitution that there's guaranteed housing, guaranteed healthcare, and the state is providing the money, but a lot of the drive, a lot of the actual organizing on the ground is coming from the affected communities themselves. So in that way, you sort of have these state institutions that are set up to implement these reforms, but then you also have, on the other hand, more democratic grassroots movements that are sort of working in tandem. It's not dual power in the classic sense, because they're at least ostensibly supposed to be collaborating. But there's definitely an undercurrent, for sure, that's more democratic and that's not necessarily dependent on state institutions.
So how would like a major change within the Venezuelan country take place? Would it sort of bubble up from the communal councils and potentially be adopted at a federal level? Does it require a referendum? Like, I don't know, like say the nationalization of an industry. How would that function within Venezuela?
That's something that would probably initially come from the state, and there are a number of different types of referendums that you can have, and one of those is a consultative referendum, which is what that would involve. It would basically be a non-binding referendum where the state would ask the people whether or not this is something that they want to do. And that's how a major institutional change like that would take place.
And I guess, like, that's what we saw. Well, I guess that wouldn't be exactly what we saw when, like, the nationalization of oil in Venezuela.
Well, actually,
was that
the
my
oil company
referendum,
was
or?
already nationalized. It's been nationalized
Okay.
for quite some time, but during the administration of the president before Chavez, it was undergoing a process of denationalization, and
Okay.
Chavez sort of stepped in and started to renationalize it, and he actually did a number of things. If I can find them in my notes. I was just going to go straight through all of this, but since there's so few of us, I figured something better. All right, so I don't know if she touched on this in the last speaker, but in 2003 there was an oil industry shutdown. It was essentially the oil industry was completely controlled by the opposition. They shut down production to try to put pressure on the government and try to make it collapse. So when that happened, they eventually got the oil industry running again by using retired workers, the military, foreign workers. And Chavez essentially fired the board and all of the managers of the state-run oil industry and replaced them with people that were more loyal to the revolution. So in doing that, he renationalized it, stopped the process of denationalization. He fired all of the opposition managers, fired all of the foreign managers, and basically told all of the foreign companies that were operating under contracts on the state oil fields that belonged to the state-run company that they had 1 year to give the state oil company 60% control of the operations that they had to leave the country. They all did, except for ExxonMobil, and their fields were expropriated.
So most of the power in Venezuela is held by the community councils?
Well, I don't know if I would go as far as to say that they hold real power, but they certainly have a greater and greater influence on Venezuelan society. I think the most revolutionary thing, I'm a socialist, and I don't, like the last speaker said, I don't think that Venezuela is a socialist country. I think it might be heading in that direction, maybe. But one of the things that's most revolutionary about the Bolivarian Revolution is the fact that you have these reforms that the government's implementing that are essentially social democratic reforms, things like housing, healthcare, education, but with the participation of the affected communities. And that's what sets this apart from your classic the state to the rescue sort of situation, is the active participation. And not only it's not just the community councils are going and saying, we need this, asking the state for money, or asking the state to do this. They're involved at every level, from planning something to implementing it. Each communal council has committees that determine their own local needs. How much water do we need? What's wrong with our water infrastructure? And then they go to and work with the local water companies to fix whatever problems there are. And they do this with state funding. But it's the drive behind it is primarily coming from these councils. So that's important.
My understanding of it was that Chavez was the one who came in and set up the community councils, right?
He endorsed them,
Yeah.
encouraged them, but I wouldn't give him credit personally for setting these things up. There is a sector of Venezuelan workers and poor people who are much more revolutionary than the government, much more revolutionary than Chavez. There are increasing numbers of workers' councils in all sorts of industries, both in state-run industries that have been nationalized and in industries where there were a lot of factories that went bankrupt during there was a financial crisis in 2002, 2003. A lot of factories went bankrupt, and the workers went in and reoccupied them, and then they were basically given the blessing by the state to continue to operate them as worker-owned factories. So they're forming all these workers' councils, and they have been really pushing hard. And finally, in 2010, the state basically they passed a law saying that we will respect the existence and protect the existence of these workers' councils. They're legal, and we're going to allow it. And not only are we going to allow it, we're going to encourage it. So the next step in that process would be there's a bill that they've been trying to pass in the National Assembly for quite some time. This must be like since 2006. Anyway, this is the left wing of the Bolivarian Revolution. are trying to pass this law where it would be required to have a workers' council in every
Wow.
business, private and public.
Wow, that's huge.
And they're really keeping up the pressure and pushing the government further and further to the left. They've been doing what they call permanent mobilization to make this happen. So there are sectors of the Venezuelan people who are much more revolutionary than the Bolivarian government, for sure.
And what are they finding, like, as social projects are being put forth by these councils? Like, what is the effectiveness of this stuff? I'm not really sure
It's
how to
mixed,
explore that
you know.
question.
Like,
But
some are more successful than others.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, the healthcare initiative has been relatively successful. Life expectancy's up, infant mortality rates way down. They've invited, I think, 16,000 Cuban doctors to come to the poorest parts of Venezuela and provide healthcare. Between 1980 and 1999, when Chavez was elected, there were 50 new healthcare clinics that were built in the country. In the first 4 years of the Chavez government, there was something like 4,600 that were built. They're just all over the place. And they provide healthcare free of charge for anybody who goes there. The Pan American Institute of Health did a survey asking people about their experience. 97% said that they were satisfied, 98% said that they didn't have any trouble getting basic health services at these clinics. So that's a success story. But then there's something like housing, which is it's in the Constitution, enshrined in the Bolivarian Constitution that everybody has a right to housing. But so far they haven't been able to make inroads into solving that problem, because there's for various reasons, but primarily what you have to remember about all these reforms, and they are reforms, is that every step of the way the opposition is doing everything they can to undermine this project. Every single thing they can possibly do to slow it down, to block it, they're going to do. And that's the real thing that you have to remember about this experiment, is that it's not being carried out under ideal conditions. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult to start to build a socialist economy and a socialist culture, which is what you say that they're trying to do when you're living in the context of a society that's still fundamentally capitalist. Mm-hmm. And what success there has been is still in this capitalist context, so they have to adapt in order to survive in that context, and it sort of undermines some of the stuff that they're trying to do. It's unfortunate.
Can you draw any parallels between the resistance that the opposition has been posing towards these movements and maybe what the American right has been doing with Obamacare?
I mean, it's certainly similar in the sense that it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to what they perceive as undermining their traditional society, their values. Part of the reason that the opposition in Venezuela was so awful and so abrasive and is because of the fact that this old ruling elite, they were really a political class. And the first thing that Chavez did when he came into office was to remove them from all their positions of power. He fired 80% of the judges in the country, for example, because he made a law saying that if a judge had 8 or more corruption charges, they were automatically dismissed. 80%.
8 or more. All right.
So this old political class immediately lost power, and it wasn't so much any of the early policies early on that made them so reactionary and so violent. It was the fact that they lost their traditional privilege and power. So they almost they launched this counter-revolution. The 2002 coup, the oil shut down in 2003, the 2004 recall referendum. They did this sort of as a counter-revolution before there was even a revolution. It was a preemptive counter-revolution. And that had the effect of, that was a huge mistake on the opposition's part, because that had the effect of radicalizing both Chavez and his supporters. And so there's this back and forth of the opposition pushing Chavez and his supporters, hardening and radicalizing. The opposition pushes harder, they just radicalize more. So they really shot themselves in the foot in that sense. So it's similar to the right in this country in that they really feel like their entire worldview is being challenged. It's not. It's different in the sense that the left there has reacted quite differently than the left here.
And Chavez died in 2011, right?
He died about a year ago.
Okay.
I think
Almost
it was a year.
exactly a year.
Yeah, like a week ago.
Okay.
So what, like, I guess, and Susan touched on the coup briefly, but I guess maybe we want to, like, just look into, like, because I know you were talking about how the state has, like, and private, private interests have tried to damage the Bolivarian project, like, basically at every avenue and, like, through every way that they can. And I guess, like the coup as, like, a case of that. I mean, I'd seen, like, a documentary and read a bit about it. But, I mean, this was literally came down to, like, private militia shooting upon crowds of demonstrators with sniper rifles from towers. And then when Chavez supporters began to defend themselves, and sometimes using violence to defend themselves from being killed, the private media in that country would just run the footage of Chavez supporters defending themselves with guns, where, like, I mean, they even showed, like, if you had looked at the entire tape, that, like, clearly there was sniper fire and they were defending, but it was painted as media as if they were, like, you know, they were the aggressors and they were just openly shooting people for no reason.
Sure.
So I guess, like, about that, and
Well, the media in Venezuela is really interesting because it's almost completely controlled by the opposition, and especially early on, there no media that was pro Chavez. There's a state-run channel now, but back in the beginning, it was all opposition media, and part of what happened, part of the effect that had, ironically, is that they were broadcasting so much anti-Chavez propaganda that they deluded themselves into actually believing that they could pull off a coup. They really actually started to believe that Chavez was deeply unpopular, that he had no support in the military, and that people weren't going to go out onto the streets to defend the Bolivarian Revolution. They were dead wrong. So in that sense, they sort of shot themselves in the foot, once again, because they started to believe the nonsense that they've been spouting, and they just kept repeating it so much that they actually believed it. And the same thing was true for the oil shutdown in 2003. They strongly believed that the entire oil industry was anti-Chavez, and it wasn't. And so they were able to get it restarted with a little bit of help from the military.
in Cuba. Yeah.
But it's kind of amazing how naive the opposition has been at times.
Mm-hmm.
Every time they make a move, it's based on misinformation, and it's based on miscalculations. I don't know if that's true this time, in terms of what's going on right now, but it certainly has been in the past. But, you know, as the biggest thing the most important thing about the Bolivarian Revolution that I think needs to be defended is the fact that it's really setting up these power structures that are completely outside the framework of the bourgeois state. And you have just the communal councils, for instance, are getting state funding that would normally go to municipal governments. Mm-hmm. And the difference here is that municipal governments are some are controlled by Chavistas, some are controlled by the opposition. But the difference is that these municipal governments they govern tons of people.